Shalom. I'm Nama Ru. This is my husband, Rabbi David Ru, and he's teaching us about the Shmita year, the 7th year of the 7-year cycle when we let the land rest. And I'm talking about Jewish people living within the traditional borders of the Holy Land. We have these laws that we are obligated to keep that are based largely on faith, but they come from the Torah. So right now we're in the 6th year. And can you tell us when the Shmita year will begin?
Yes and no, like everything. So the Gemara at the very beginning of Rosh Hashanah, the first Mishnah, gives Rosh Hashanah for different things. It gives Rosh Hashanah for years, Rosh Hashanah for kings, Rosh Hashanah for trees, and there it says that the Rosh Hashanah for Shmita is the first day of Tishrei, what we commonly call Rosh Hashanah. And you would think that would be it, but it's not so simple. On Daf Yud Gimel Amid Beis, the Gemara says, Amar Rabba said, Amar Rebbanan, Ilan Basar Chanata, when fruit of a tree is sanctified with the sanctity of Shmita, it depends upon when the Chanata was.
What's that?
That's a very good question, and in fact, we're not going to discuss it in this lesson, but I think in the next one.
Okay.
Tevua vezeitim basar shalish, grains, the 5 species of grains for which the land of Israel is praised, wheat, oats, rye, spelt, and barley, when there are a third grown, Yerek basar Lekita, and vegetables after when they're harvested. So this obviously isn't corresponding to the Shmita starts in Rosh Hashanah. Well, it does start in Rosh Hashanah, but this is the point. These various things happening is what determines whether this particular food grew on Rosh Hashanah. It grew on the year of the Shmita, the 6th year of the Shmita cycle, or at the end of the process in the 1st year of the next Shmita cycle, or the 8th year of the previous Shmita cycle. So the Gemara says, again in Rosh Hashanah, this is Yud Beis on Beis, Hatvuah ve'azeitim Meshieviu Shalish, that the grains, the 5 species of grains, and the olives, when they're a third grown. Manahani Miلی, where do you get this from? Amar Ravasi, Amar Rabbi Yוחנן. Ravasi said the name of Rabbi Yוחנן. Umatu ba mishmei the Rabbi Yossi Haglili, and he said it in the name of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, Mikate sheva shanim b'moed shnata shmita b'chag asukot. The pasuk says that at the end of the 7 years, at the time of the Shmita, on Chag Sukkos. Now this pasuk is talking about the Sukkos after the Shmita year, in the 8th year of the cycle, or the 1st year of the next cycle. Shmita ma Avidat b'chag Sukkos. What are we talking about? The Shmita and Sukkos. Shminisi. This is the 8th year. Ela Omer Lacha. It's to tell you. Kol tevua sheyaviu shlish b'shvi'is lifnei Rosh Hashanah. Atano hegba minhag shvi'is b'shminis. That any grains that were a third grown on the Shmita year, you conduct yourself as if they had grown on the Shmita year, even though you're harvesting them in the 8th year. So there's an interesting thing that we have other things that are like grains, things like rice, things that are grown similarly. I mean, you plant a whole field of them at a time. And we call them kitniot, which includes more things than Ashkenazim don't eat on Pesach.
You mean like beans?
Beans, rice,
lentils,
peas. There are all sorts of things that can be kitnios. It's basically the things that you normally plant a whole field of and they grow from rainwater. It's not from, we don't normally grow them based on irrigation. And we'll see why this is true in a minute. So the Rambam says, התבואה והקטניos. He puts the two together, the grains and the kitnios, in the same category. So if also for these other things, if they're a third grown before the year begins, then they would be considered of that year. And if they're not a third year grown before Rosh Hashanah, they would be considered in the year in which they achieve a third of their growth. Rashi explains that grains and the kitnios are prohibited to eat because of svichim. But trees, the fruit that grows on trees, are permitted. They just have the sanctity of Shmita. Svichim are things that grow by themselves. If they grew by themselves, we suspect, there is a time during Mishnaic times when they started to suspect that people planted them on their own, even though they appear to be growing on their own. People would do this so they would get more things, and so they prohibited these. And we'll discuss more about this later. Rashi also says that all things that are domet letevua, things that are similar to grains, gam be'anavim, vezeitim, also grapes and olives, they also follow a third of growth.
So those are both considered tree fruits.
They are tree fruits, but they're different than other tree fruits. Now, these things, it's true because of the water source for them, as we're going to see in a minute. Rabbi Akiva says, this is a Gemara in Rosh Hashanah Yud Dalet, Amud Aleph, when you gather up from your granary and your wine and olive press, what is true about the granary and the presses, that they grow on the majority of water, and therefore they are tithed for the year in which most of them grew, where they achieved a third growth. Af kol gidulin al rov mayim. So this is true of everything that grows in the majority of water. Mitasrin l'shnasha avra. They go in the year that they got the most of their water. Yatsu yirakos. This excludes vegetables. Shigdilim al kol mayim. They grow on all water. Mitasrin l'shana haba. And they are tied for the next year. This is a slightly dense piece of Gemara, and you can't understand it without what Rashi says. So Rashi says that the grains, the olives, and the grapes, they are watered by rain primarily, and once they're a third grown, they can be harvested, although with a little bit of difficulty, and used at that point. And what grows from then on is very useful for us, but it's not critical. And since they've achieved their useful state in the 6th year, even though we harvest them in the 7th year, they're considered fruit of the 6th year. Whereas he says vegetables, tomatoes, eggplants, cucumbers, and so on, I harvest some now, and within a week I have more, right? And that if there's no water, if I don't irrigate them and there's no rain, another one won't grow. In Eretz Yisrael, the ground is too dry naturally for them to continue growing in that way. Therefore, since they need the water right now to develop, whenever I harvest them, they're growing on the water that exists right now, on their irrigation that we gave them now. And therefore, if I harvest them on Gimel Tishrei, the first day after Rosh Hashanah, right, they then have the sanctity of Shmita, because they grew on
from the current irrigation.
From the irrigation that they received during Shmita, and therefore they have the sanctity of Shmita. So we see there's a difference between these two categories, and it depends upon their critical water source as to whether we consider them fruit of the 6th year or fruit of the 7th year. And going into Motzi Shvis, it has the same thing. meaning grapes that even though we harvest them in the 8th year, because they receive most of their water and they've reached the 3rd growth before Rosh Hashanah, therefore, even though I harvest them afterwards, they have this special halacha of still having the sanctity of the Shemitah year.
So if they have that sanctity of the Shmita, we don't separate Truma Maser. We
Correct.
make them public domain. They're available pretty much to whoever. Right. The property is not private, or at least it's made available to the public.
Well, it's God's, and God says, I'm not giving it to you this year. I'm giving it to everyone this year.
Okay. And I really look forward to figuring out in what ways can I maintain my garden during the Shemitah year.
Well, we're a long way from that, but we'll get there.
We're going to have to get there really soon because Shemitah's coming.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
A month and a half away or so.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.